enchiladas, and I'm going to talk about all the jobs that I've had, because I've had some weird ones. If this is the first time you're watching one of my videos, hi! Yep, there's a lot of components out in front of me here. I'm going to make some breakfast ones, so this is some tofu scramble. I made some homemade refrieds with black beans and homemade soup stock. I made a homemade cheese sauce. I made homemade enchilada sauce. It's actually just cooling down still, so it's going to thicken up a bit more. I made caramelized onions and some ground round. So I'm going to do 2 different types of breakfast and a dinner or lunch. I've prepped all of that in advance, and if you're one of my patrons, which I don't know if I know how to put links up, but there'll be a link somewhere. There's always a link in the description box. If you're one of my patrons, you will see all the recipes for all this stuff. I am really deliberate about making content that the folks who are subscribed to me are interested in, so I run a lot of polls to see what people are up for. So for example, in April on Patreon, it is Pie Month. One of the functions of my Patreon is that I do a veganize it. So I will pick a recipe from someone who follows me there, or pick a favorite food, and then I find a way to make it vegan and kind of updating folks as I go. That's something I really like doing. I kind of like Patreon as a space to bring you into the food content that I make. And just last night, I posted a whole bunch of free recipes over on Patreon. So there's a free post. When you click on it, you don't have to be a member of Patreon, you don't have to pay any money, but I've got a listing of some of the barbecue go-to recipes that I use. So a portobello mushroom burger marinade, and potato salad, and a couple different seasoning suggestions for other barbecue items. So if you're curious about Patreon, you can find that there, and it's free. And you kind of get a little glimpse of what the kind of content that I'm creating on Patreon is. And if you're interested in how fast I talk and you want more of that in your life, then you could follow me on Instagram. I post on Instagram a lot. I am a very avid stories user. I do love to cook, and I actually usually really like filming YouTube videos, but it's really one-sided and it can feel super vulnerable. So all of these recipes, the beans, the tofu, the nacho cheese, the enchilada sauce, are going to be up on Patreon when this video is posted. So if you're a patron, go check it out and make it, because once I found this enchilada sauce recipe, I think we've made enchiladas like 2 or 3 times a month since. And what's great about it is that both the sauce recipe and the cheese recipe can be made gluten-free and freeze really, really well. So throw them in the freezer. Like, I made a triple batch of cheese and a double batch of sauce today. I'm gonna throw the leftovers in the freezer, and then next time all I need to do is prep the filling, so it's much faster. The enchiladas themselves also freeze super well. So most of this I'm gonna be freezing because I made just an absolute shit ton. Breakfast enchiladas are going to be smoky refried black beans and tofu scramble, a little bit of lime juice, some cilantro, salsa, enchilada sauce, cheese sauce, but you'll watch the hands doing the thing while the mouth does the speak. Okay? I started working a lot when I was quite young. So I got a job at Tim Hortons when I was 14, and then I kind of worked my way up through the barista world. So I worked at Tim Hortons, and then I worked at Starbucks for a little bit, and I ended up taking a job after high school in Jasper, Alberta. So I'm from Edmonton. I started as a barista, and it was a really, really specific experience. I don't know how else to describe that. Being 18 and having the kind of childhood that I did, which was really tough. It was really tough, and a lot of my focus was more on, I guess, kind of like survival. I didn't have like a wild youth era until I moved to Jasper, and then it was just like absolutely bonkers. This was basically a lot of transient workers, so folks who didn't necessarily live there all year round, but instead came because spaces like the mountains in Alberta are really seasonal. So it's super, super, super busy in the summer and less busy in the winter. Mountains, winter, you think, yeah, it's gonna be so freaking chaotic in the winter, of course, because snow, skiing, you know, but it just wasn't one of those go-to places for that. So it was super busy in the summer, and there would be a jillion staff, and then in the winter it was really quiet. I worked in a bunch of different restaurants within the hotel. The cool thing about a hotel like that is that if you're working in the sort of restaurant or hospitality space, there's lots of flexibility to work in different areas. You could work in room dining, or like the banquets area, or in the restaurants or the lounge, or there was just so many different jobs that you could do. So I lived in Jasper for just over 2 years. The last job that I had there was a switchboard operator. So at this time I would have been about 20, and I was a switchboard operator at this hotel in this national park. It sounds very like old-timey, but it was basically like connecting people within the hotel. So you were sort of like the communications for the whole hotel, which maybe sounds really boring. It was not. It was like the most intense multitasking I have ever done in any job of my life. It also, I think, really grew me up because there was a real sense of responsibility. So part of my job there was doing things like running fire drills and emergency evacuations when necessary. Because we were in a national park, our switchboard was the first responder over the phones to any emergencies. I also took things like bear calls. So quite a few times we would get calls to dispatch the security at the hotel to the different hotel rooms or to staff accommodations because there was bears. And my apartment actually was on a grizzly migration path. So we saw bears a lot, and I heard a lot about bears and responded to a lot of calls about bears. But I also responded to calls like, hey, there's about 150 elk outside my building. Okay, maybe not 150, but like, hey, there's like 25 elk outside my building. I can't leave. Can you get someone to come down and pick me up because I can't walk to work? It was both cool and sort of terrifying to be a young person and doing a job like that, because I took it really seriously and because it taught me so much about the inner workings of one of these like massive hotels. My favorite part, maybe, which exposes me as a total loser, was that we got to use CB radios. So we got to use like the trucker radios, and we got to learn the like trucker radio chat. I'm sure someone who owns a CB radio is absolutely horrified at the way that I'm saying that, but we got to learn like, what's your 20? That's probably the only thing I remember, but I loved it. I am like admittedly sort of a power hungry loser, so I liked being able to boss people around on the radio, which was like a good proportion of that job. At that point, I decided that I either needed to stay and make that hotel space sort of my future deal. You know, I was offered a grown-up job, like a salaried position that I didn't super want, and that was when I chose to move to Winnipeg to go to school. And I had gone from, you know, at that point, 7 years in hospitality, doing various jobs, and then I moved to a really small, I mean, it's a small city, but it's basically a small town where everyone knows everyone. And I had done these like high-end, very fancy restaurant jobs, and I knew no one here. And so I was taking very sort of like first serving job because I didn't have the like inside connections, which was pretty humbling because I'd gone from this like incredibly, this incredibly wealthy clientele in Jasper where folks just had money. Like people were taking the vacation of their dreams or, did those kind of vacations all the time. And were really used to spending money. They tipped super well. Their expectations of service were really high, to working in like basically like not tip serving jobs, which is really brutal because I absolutely hate serving. I hope that I'm not gonna jinx myself. I've been really afraid to like acknowledge that because it like kept me afloat for so long, but it is such an exhausting and awful industry for me. More than just for me, I think for a lot of people that's the case. This enchilada sauce it's like a little bit mole-ish. It starts with a roux and it's quite nutty and like buttery. I add cinnamon to mine. It's real good. And then this is a nacho cheese sauce. So to this I've added cilantro, cumin, chili powder, lime juice. It's the best cheese I've ever made. So I'd had this humbling experience going from kind of like the restaurant big time, working in fine dining and like making good money, and being 18 and having no real expenses, to living in Winnipeg, working for minimum wage in really not great serving environments. People often misinterpret me as like super extroverted. I am not extroverted. I'm not shy by any means, but I do find human interaction very draining. Mostly because any moment where I can't be exactly how I am will exhaust me indescribably. And serving is basically being paid to be what someone else wants from you. So sometimes people wanted me to not pay any attention to them. Sometimes people wanted me to pretend to be their friend. I got written up. I'm obviously a big teacher's pet, so being written up was a big deal. I got written up in one of my serving jobs because I didn't laugh at this guy's jokes and he complained about me. That's real. That's a real story. Because they weren't funny. And also, I'm making minimum wage and he knew he wasn't gonna tip me. And I was like, you're gross. I don't wanna laugh at your jokes. As you can probably imagine, with that attitude, serving was not a great fit. I found people that I liked, like genuinely liked. I loved serving. I would happily do that forever. Because I love food. I love opportunities to connect with people over food. And one of the best things that I learned from fine dining was I ended up in serving positions where people would come in and just say, tell me what to get. So some of my favorite customers were people who were like, I would like you to just pick my meal from start to finish. And this is fine dining. These are like 4 or 5 course meals with dessert, with espresso. Staff of a restaurant are who you want to pick your food. They're gonna know what the best thing is. They're gonna know what the thing they're supposed to be pushing is, and if you connect with your server and you like them, they'll probably pick something good. So I loved that component, which happened maybe 1 out of every like 150 times, and the rest of the time it was agony. It was agony. The expectation of managers is always that like serving somehow feeds your soul, like you just genuinely love serving people so much that it's like so rewarding for you. I believe that that's true for some people, but I assure you that it is not for me. There was a regular, and this person was pretty strange. Had a really strange order. Their order was cheesecake and a Budweiser. Okay, do you. I'm not here to food shame anyone. Enjoy what you enjoy. And they would sit where I worked for hours. And they always had this backpack full of papers that that they would shuffle through while they were there, and I assumed that this person had some sort of job that required them to be doing paperwork, or, you know, required them to need all these weird mystery papers. At the very end of my time working at this establishment, which shall remain unnamed, I walked by this person's table while they were in the washroom, and the papers were hundreds of pictures of Hannah Montana. I don't think I'm exaggerating when I say hundreds. Maybe 100 pictures of Hannah Montana. Like, printed from the community library. And so I'm just delighted by that in a way that I can't even begin to describe, that this person would just come in and like, and like be sorting the papers, and they were just printed pictures of Hannah Montana. It was incredibly wonderful. I worked for a while in a banquet serving, which is still to this day the most physically laborious job I have ever had, where you would carry out these like gigantic trays. They were like probably this big, as you can see this, with 8 plates on them, 8 or 10. So you'd like go and lift them up and you'd carry them out, these like unbelievably hot plates covered with a little cover, and then you'd have to hand them out, and you had to be able to carry 4 at once and hand them out perfectly. And suffice it to say, I was not awesome at that. Serving 800 people for lunch with a team of like 30 other people. In that time, I served hundreds of weddings. I'm not someone who ever thought about my wedding, but when it came to sort of plan or consider that, I had this frame of reference of like hundreds of just excruciatingly cookie cutter weddings where they were, when I try and think back and like remember a really like poignant or interesting moment, I genuinely can't, because they just all blend together because they were so similar. People were spending up to $1 million on these weddings. After my hatred of serving, I continued to work my way up the ladder, because if you really hate something, why not do it for higher stakes and like supervise? Or I eventually became the general manager of a restaurant. So there's a local chain who are a little bit notorious for the way that they treat their staff, but who shall remain unnamed so that no one's gonna sue me. But I was a manager of a restaurant. I managed, whether that was like as an assistant manager or a manager, like general manager, for over a year, and regularly worked 14 or 16-hour days for what amounted to less than minimum wage, and liked some elements of it. I think it was a really cool job in that I really got to trust my own problem-solving skills. When people rely on you and you're sort of like where the shit stops, so like if something's going wrong, the badness has to stop with you, like there's no one who's gonna catch it for you. You learn how to solve problems pretty quick. Maybe not successfully, but pretty quickly. It was incredibly tense because I was working for a company that didn't share my values. Under capitalism, which doesn't value human life. Quit that. Then I worked in a healthcare center, and I did a whole bunch of different jobs. So I worked at the front desk. I worked doing sort of general clinic tasks. I worked doing intake. I have always been really passionate about healthcare. I think mostly because I've been chronically ill my whole life, and very harmfully. It is the responsibility of the individual to survive our healthcare system, and that even really well-intentioned staff and care professionals can still do a lot of harm without intending it. And or just not meet needs. Ugly and delicious. The organization that I worked for was a community health center who did a lot of different kinds of work. And because I'm someone who is really invested in healthcare, I wanted to do all the kinds of work. I did sort of a lot of different jobs while I worked for this organization, but I didn't do all the ones that I had wanted. I wanted to work in their birthing program because I really wanted to be a midwife for a long time. In fact, it is still something I think of a lot. Midwives have a lot of agency in Canada. They're really able to basically do all the caring for the pregnant person. They become like their doctor, and that was really appealing to me. I'm also just kind of a big dork, and things like that make me so emotional and happy and feel so alive and human. Instead, I worked in their abortion clinic, I worked in their medical clinic. Being in an organization like that meant that I got a lot of face-to-face time, especially with young people. Then got a position working in a specific program at this organization that focused on eating disorders. So again, doing like assistant work. I am often reluctant to talk about that job because particularly in queer community, eating disorders are incredibly common and there isn't a lot of space to talk about them. And I am not a clinician or a therapist. I worked in a program where I did intake and like prepared booklets. So I was not and am not an expert. I learned a lot from the folks that I worked with. So throughout my work at this organization, I worked in the medical program, I worked in an eating disorder program, and I worked in an abortion program. I got to work with so many different people. I worked with dietitians, I worked with therapists, I worked with social workers, I worked with nurses, I worked with physicians, I worked with other medical assistants, people who had a ton of different experiences and who were coming to the work with a ton of different ideas and a lot of passion. So my work in the program focusing on eating disorders was incredibly rewarding. It was also really difficult as someone who has a past history with eating disorders and also as someone who sometimes struggles to set boundaries around, you know, what things are mine to take on and what things are not. I really became like really acutely aware of how harmful institutionalized sizeism is. So how harmful it is when institutions actively work to oppress people in larger bodies. And our healthcare system most acutely has a really brutal and violent and harmful anti-fat bias. And it was really difficult to see how that played out in that job. It was also really difficult to not know anything. I was so not an expert and I had such an acute desire to help. But it also taught me how much this is gonna sound very messed up, but I really work well and am happy working in crisis. The challenge that I had, whether it was doing intakes for an abortion program or for an eating disorder program, I really felt the urgency and struggled to not get swept up in it. When I think that about, you know, what my capacity was, I was really incapable of providing care. I could listen, and that was about it. I could listen and provide information. And I just burnt out, which is actually the theme of every job I've ever had. I go in, I learn everything I can, I very often have made the mistake of trying to change things before I understand them, which is so infuriating. If you've ever been on the other side of that, I think I sort of paid my penance with that once I became a restaurant manager, because I would have new staff come in who like really wanted to change things that existed a certain way for a reason. And their ideas were often great, but weren't possible or plausible or practical. What I found was really cool was that the work that I did in restaurants, whether that was managing a restaurant or whether that was serving or being a barista or a host or cleaning up or whatever, all of that really prepared me to do every other job that I've ever had. The skills that I had in sort of like reading the room after serving for so long and in making conversation with people that I didn't know meant that I didn't often feel uncomfortable even if situations were difficult. And working in an abortion clinic and an eating disorder program, situations were sometimes difficult. So I was grateful that I had had this experience that enabled me to more comfortably navigate that and maybe better read people as they came in so that I could show up for them in a more meaningful way. I didn't talk about any of my academic jobs. I also had a lot of academic jobs, and I was also a student while that was happening. The more invested that I was in whatever job I was doing, the quicker I burned out. And maybe the next video I make, I will have 0.1% of more of an answer as to who I am without having all these jobs, because every moment of having any of these jobs, the having of the job and the doing of the job is a lot of what defined who I was. So when I worked in an eating disorder program, even though I only worked half-time, I was so deeply invested in that world and I kind of soaked up as much of it as possible. And when I ran a restaurant, it was my entire life 24/7. You know, there would be alarms on my phone at 2 in the morning because something was going wrong at the restaurant, and it was my whole life. And now YouTube is not my whole life. At every point I've sort of shaved off little pieces of myself to try and fit, and that's really contributed to the burnout. And I found myself with a tendency to do that with YouTube too. That I want to create things that are more aesthetic or more approachable. I often feel overwhelmed about making cooking videos because I don't cook perfectly every time. A lot of my cooking does not turn out. And I feel like there is an expectation that I know what I'm doing, and I just super don't at all in any way. So here's a weird bad video about it. I would love it if you would thumbs me up, because that's how we measure success on this platform. If you want to comment and say, Arista, this video is not as shit as you think, or Arista, this video is shitter than you could have ever possibly imagined, that would be cool.